All right, so our study for this evening is going to be in Daniel chapter 5. And as you know, we've been going through the book of Daniel. And here in chapter 5, we have a story of a king that has issues with pride. And when we look at, Daniel chapter 1, 2, all the way through chapter 4, we learn how Nebuchadnezzar also had these problems. We know he had pride issues. We also learned that he believed that he was amazing. And toward the end of his reign, God shows him a really, really, really good lesson. And who remembers what that lesson was? This was the best lesson of his life that Nebuchadnezzar experienced. What was that lesson? Who remembers? That's in Daniel chapter 4. Most of the students here have been going through Daniel. So what was the biggest lesson of Nebuchadnezzar's life? A lesson that God had to teach him. What was that lesson? Who remembers? So what was the biggest lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learned in chapter 4? It was a huge life lesson. God had to send him away for a while. 7 years. So where did he send him? Where did Nebuchadnezzar go to? Nebuchadnezzar thought very highly of himself. History tells us, and even archaeologists have found, that Nebuchadnezzar had such a huge thought of who he was that when he would build some of the temples, he had engraved or stamped in each brick his name and what he claimed he was very good at. And so you can imagine the amount of bricks that they produced to build buildings, and so his name was throughout the whole building. So he thought that he was this amazing guy. And so toward the end, God tells him and gives him a warning and tells him, look, if you don't recognize that I am the God of heaven, you're going to be away for a while. So for some time, he kind of listens to what God had to say, but then he kind of forgets. And then one day he's standing out in his window and he looks at how amazing Babylon was, and he begins to ask himself a question. And the question was, isn't this such an amazing country? He had built it, infrastructure was amazing. Last time we talked about the finances were amazing. At this time, Babylon was at its peak, and finally God had to teach him a lesson. And God said, all right, if you believe you're capable of doing all of this, if you believe that you have done this with your power and your might, then how about you go for a little trip for 7 years? And he lost his mind for 7 years, and he was living outside. The Bible tells us that his nails grew very long, his hair grew, his beard grew, and he finally, at the end of this 7 years, he learns his lesson, and he realizes that God is the God that has power. God is the one that sets kings. He's the one that takes away kings. And he finally has this realization. And then in chapter 4, we see what he declares, and we see this amazing prayer that Nebuchadnezzar has. So now we're going to go now into chapter 5, Daniel chapter 5. But before we go there, let's quickly review what Daniel chapter 2:21 said. So Daniel chapter 2:21 says, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. When you were looking into Daniel, what does this verse remind you of? When we look at the visions that Daniel had, there is an entity and a power that claims to do this very exact same thing, something that only belongs to God. And so the next question that we want to see and that we want to consider is, can a kingdom fall in a single night? And can a life fall in a single night? Oftentimes when we're very young, it's very hard for you to think that at some point you might get sick, perhaps that at some point you might lose your life. When you're young, we really don't think of danger. We kind of feel that life will go on forever. We really don't think about death. And finally, when we come very close to death, most of us will have a reality check and realize that we're very frail. And so when we go to this story here, we're going to realize how powerful God is, and we're also going to realize that God has everything in his hands. And hopefully we can get that slide there. But just imagine that right behind me we have a quick genealogy of the kings of Babylon. And this is very important because the first king that we're all very familiar with is King Nebuchadnezzar. And so after King Nebuchadnezzar, right around 562, we have the next king, and his name is Marduk. And after that, the next king will be Neriglissar. And his reign was from 550 to 556. And then in 556, there's something very strange that happens in Babylon. There's a really, really young king, and so historians believe that this young king was really, really small, that in fact, he had to be disciplined. And so there's a little bit of, the historians can't agree how young he was. Some believe that he was really young, that he had to actually be spanked every now and then for him to learn. And others just believe that he was fairly young. But what actually ended up happening to him is he actually died, and it is believed that perhaps, and this is just an assumption, that perhaps Belshazzar had something to do with the killing of this king. And so right around 556 all the way to 539, we had this king, and his name was Nabonidus. And so he reigned up until 539. So this king was very interesting because he actually focused a lot on religion. Unlike the other kings, they liked to focus a lot on conquest, and they wanted to be amazing. But this king was very different. He actually focused a lot on religion. And he was very obsessed with the god of the moon. For some reason, he was very obsessed. We can go to, let's see, slide 4. If we can go to slide 4. Right there. So he was very obsessed with religion, with his religion. And as a result, Belshazzar comes into the picture, and he becomes kind of like think about it like a co-regent. And so he governed between 553 all the way to 539. And he was the one that actually took care of the kingdom. The other, Nabonidus, he was doing his own thing, spreading the gospel of the god moon, and so he was very interested in that. And so Belshazzar actually takes care of everything else. And so we're going to go to the very next slide. And so we want to set a little bit of the stage of what happens before Babylon actually falls. And so what was at stake with Belshazzar? So history tells us that he actually inherited quite a bit of money. And so he was very invested when it came to Babylon. And so when it came to actually protecting Babylon, he had a lot of interest in that. And so he was financing military operations. And so now let's go ahead and see what was going on before Cyrus actually comes into Babylon. So what was going on? So when we look at how these armies come into Babylon, one of the biggest questions that we have is, well, did they actually know that they were coming? And so this is what we know. What did Belshazzar actually know about this conquest or this danger, imminent danger? And so he knew a couple of things. So first of all, he knew by 539 BC, Cyrus, he was already known. And so he had already taken over Media, he had already taken over Lydia, and also most of Mesopotamia. So he was very, very active. And so by this, Belshazzar was kind of aware that at some point, this king was going to come and try and take over Babylon. But there was something that Belshazzar trusted in quite a bit. And so most of you know that Babylon had a wall that was 300 feet high. So it was very wide, it was very big, and you also had the river, Euphrates, that would go through the city. And so let's say that you were surrounded by armies, what would happen? If you have water coming in through the city, you at least are ensured that you're going to have food. You can actually grow your own food. And also history tells us that they would be able to survive for the next 20 years. So do you actually think that an army would actually be surrounding Babylon for 20 years? That was not going to happen. And so it is believed that he was very confident, even though these other armies from Cyrus were getting very close to home. He was very confident that nothing was going to happen to him. If you have amazing walls, if you have water in the city, if you have food, you have nothing to worry about. And so why do you think the party actually happened? We have actually two options of why he decided to have this party. He realized that in his kingdom things were not going very well. And so perhaps it was more like a denial thing, or perhaps it was also political theater. Maybe he wanted to distract some of his governors, and so he invites them into this party. But one thing we also have to remember is that the Bible tells us that he invites 1,000 people. But if we remember, you also had wives, you have concubines, so it is estimated that in this huge party, he had around 5,000 guests during this time. And so now let's go to Daniel chapter 5, 1 through 2. Daniel chapter 5, 1 through 2. And it says here, Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords. So again, remember, they had their wives. They also had their concubines. And so they're drinking wine. Verse 2, it says, while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And so if you remember, a couple of chapters before, what was one of the reasons why Daniel didn't want to partake of the king's food? Who remembers? Why didn't he want to partake of the king's food? Who remembers that phrase that he actually said? He said, I'm not going to partake of the king's food because of what? Anyone? He said, I don't want to be contaminated with the king's food. And so Daniel knew that whenever they had these huge gatherings, whenever they had these huge feasts, what was actually going on at these feasts? Lots of things were going on. First of all, they were drinking. Also, history tells us that whenever they got together, they had orgies. And so this was very common in these kinds of feasts. And so to top it all off, in this drunken stupor that Belshazzar finds himself, he finally says, you know what? Remember that country that we conquered? Go ahead, grab these vessels. And this was the ultimate defiance to God himself. And now let's see what happens in verse 3 to 4. It says, in verse 3 or 4, it says, then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of silver, bronze, and iron, wood, and stone. What do you think was so wrong about what Belshazzar did? What do you think was so wrong? What do you think? What do you think was so wrong? What did he do that was so wrong? What do you think? Well, first of all, we're going to go through the list of things that he actually did very wrong. Verse 3, it says, then they brought the gold vessels that they had taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. So now let's go a little before, and let's go to Daniel chapter 5, verse 5. What is one of the first things that they do wrong? It says here that they praise the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. So the first thing that they were doing is what? They were praising the god of silver and bronze. They were not praising God. And so the question that we're going to ask ourselves is going to be, well, these are all pagan nations. Why wasn't God merciful to them? After all, they don't claim to worship God, as opposed to the Israelites. Why is God bringing this judgment upon Belshazzar? So let's keep going. In verse 19, Romans 1, 19 and 20, it says, because that what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invincible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So who are we actually talking about here? Did Belshazzar have any knowledge of what his grandfather experienced? What do you think? He definitely had, to some extent, he had this knowledge. And so he was literally without excuse. But even if you were to say, okay, Belshazzar did not know what was going on. After all, this was, his grandfather's experience. He didn't have this experience himself. He actually didn't have any encounter with God. What is Romans telling us here? When we look at nature, we have sufficient evidence to a point where we can have a knowledge of who God is, and none of us are without excuse. In verse 18, who are we talking about? For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of man who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. So we're talking about literally everyone. In Step to Christ, page 9, Steps to Christ, page 9, it says that nature and revelation alike testify of God's love. Our Father in heaven is a source of life, of wisdom, and of joy. Then she adds, look at the wonderful and beautiful things of nature. So even if somebody doesn't have, let's say, access to the Bible, you can actually learn about God's love by simply looking to nature. You can look at nature and look and learn how God is and who God really is. Now, as we continue to go in chapter 5, all of a sudden in the midst of this party, somebody comes into the scene which brings Belshazzar to fear. And in Daniel chapter 5 through 6, it says that in the same hour, the finger of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the platter of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And then in verse 6, then the king's countenance changed and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. So you can imagine the scene. God, as he calls for all these vessels to be brought, he brings these vessels from the temple. In that same hour, the Bible tells us that all of a sudden a finger of a man appears and begins to write in this wall. And what was the king's reaction? All of a sudden, you can imagine he was drunk, and he realizes that something is changed. He looks that there's a hand that is writing something on the wall, and then all of a sudden he literally begins to shake. I remember my dad had an experience back when he was not in the church. He used to drink, he used to drink socially back in Mexico. And one of the experiences that he has is that it was around 2 a.m. in the morning. And so they were all coming back from the party. And he said that he was coming back, and they saw this kind of like a light. And I'm not sure if he had been reading about aliens or something like that, but he says that the minute that he saw that light that he could not explain, all of a sudden they forgot that they were drunk, they got back to their senses, and they just took off and went home. And so you can imagine this experience for King Belshazzar. They were probably very drunk, they weren't thinking straight, and in this drunken state they decided that they're going to bring the vessels from the temple, which was a very dumb idea. And then the judgment comes, and so they begin to see this writing on the wall, and so he begins to tremble. And then in verse 7, Daniel 5, 7 through 8, it tells us that the king cries aloud to bring the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. One of the things that it's very interesting here is that Belshazzar reacts the very same way that King Nebuchadnezzar reacted when he couldn't figure things out. And this is something that we often do as human beings. Oftentimes when we need to get something done, when we're going through different trials or we need help, we always go to the things that we know that can help us. And in this case, back when we were looking at the story of Nebuchadnezzar, whenever he couldn't understand the dream, whenever he couldn't understand the vision that he had at the night, what did he do? The exact same reaction. He calls the Chaldeans, he calls the astrologers, the magicians. They can't help him, and finally they call in Daniel because he had the Spirit of the Lord. And so Belshazzar does the same thing. He goes ahead, he calls them, he brings them in, and then it says that the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So, going back to the history of the kings, who was the actual king when Nebuchadnezzar was kind of ruling? Who remembers? Who was the actual king? Remember that Belshazzar was not he was co-regent with the actual king. So, technically, Belshazzar was the second in command. You had your king, and Belshazzar was the second in command. And what was Belshazzar actually offering to whomever was able to interpret this writing? He was offering the best of the best of the best, the best thing that he could offer. He was offering third place. He was second place, and so he was offering third place. And so he promised them clothing that were purple, a chain of gold, and also third ruler in the kingdom. And so verse 8, it says, "Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation." Isn't it something when we come to a dead end and we think that we can do things, we call the best people that we know, and we finally realize that we can't do it on our own. And so this is how Belshazzar feels during this point. Now, let us go very quickly to these 3 points. What did they actually mean? So back in those times, purple was a sign of royalty. So what he was offering to them, to whomever was able to interpret this dream, was what? He was offering to them pretty much royalty. And then, in those times, a chain of gold was actually a sign of high social status. So if somebody gifted you a chain of gold, that meant that you were very well respected, that you were high social status. And then, of course, being offered a third position in the kingdom was the best of the best of the best. But then something happens. Here in chapter 5, the queen comes into the picture. This queen had been around with Nebuchadnezzar, and so she comes in, and then she gives him a counsel. In verse 9, it says, "Then the king, Belshazzar, was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall." So you can imagine this queen wasn't in here, and so she hears the commotion. She realizes that something is going on, so she comes into the hall, and she talks to the king and says, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change." Oftentimes we think of all the Babylonians as people that were pagans, but what this queen was actually doing was very amazing. What was she actually doing for the king? Whether, we know that he had sinned. We know that he had crossed that line. But what she was actually offering was something really amazing. When we go to verse 11, what is she actually offering to him? In verse 11, it says, "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God, and in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers." So all of a sudden, she's offering to Belshazzar somebody that has the answer. And she recognizes that Daniel has the spirit of the holy God. And then in verse 12, it says, "Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge and understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." And so here we see how God was able again to work through Daniel and bring the interpretation to this king. Now, we're going to go now to 28, and we're going to be looking at what was actually in this writing. And so in verse 22 to 23, it says, "But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this." One of the things that chapter 5 makes it very clear, and we already touched on it before, is that Belshazzar was not ignorant of the things that God had done. It kind of seemed that Belshazzar had never actually had an encounter with God. God hadn't talked to him, but he wasn't ignorant of the experiences that his father had. And so here Daniel tells him very clearly, but you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. So what did Belshazzar actually knew? Belshazzar actually knew what Nebuchadnezzar had actually gone through. He knew of all of those experiences. He actually knew that his grandfather had actually gone for 7 years and God had taught him that lesson. He knew all of this. And then Daniel goes on to say, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And so we see here that at this point, Daniel has this holy boldness. He's telling the king that he has messed up. He's telling him that you knew this. You knew what God had done with your grandfather. And then here it says, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. These last words were very powerful. Look what he actually tells the king. He says, you have defied whom? You have actually defied the God that holds your breath in his hands. You have actually defied the God that gives you life. And so there's 3 key things that Daniel breaks down for him. And so first, we know that Belshazzar knew better and he didn't act on it. Second, we see that he exalts himself against the Lord. And thirdly, we see that he gives glory to idols instead of God. And this is very reminiscent of what we actually see in Daniel 7:25. And these 3 themes keep coming up as we go through the book of Daniel. In Daniel 7:25, it tells us, and he shall speak great words against the Most High. Same thing as what Belshazzar did. So now going back to Daniel 5:26, we're going to look at what was the actual writing on the wall. And so Daniel explained to him what the interpretation is. And it says, this is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And then in verse 26, it tells us that Mene, God had numbered your kingdom and he has finished it. And then in verse 27, Tekel, another word for weight, is also measured. God has measured you in the balances and you have been found wanting. Now, when God reveals this to Daniel, and Daniel makes this known to the king, you would expect that Belshazzar will have like this enlightening moment. He'll come and he'll probably repent because he's finally realized that he has defied God. Very different than the reaction that, let's say, Nebuchadnezzar had. Whenever he had that encounter with God, what actually happened? He has this moment and realizes that he has sinned, and so he confesses. But Belshazzar does something very strange. In verse 29, it says that he commands, that Belshazzar commands, and so they go ahead, they send Daniel to be clothed with scarlet, just as he had promised, and they put a golden chain about his neck, and they make a proclamation concerning him, and they said, all of a sudden now Daniel is a third ruler in the kingdom. But this was of no use, because in verse 30, we're told that the Chaldeans come, and it says, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. Now, it's interesting that the real king, he wasn't killed. He was actually just exiled. And so what makes this very amazing is that when we go to Isaiah 45, verse 1, and if you ever want one of the best proofs that the Bible fulfills itself and that the Bible is real, go to Isaiah 41 and look what it says. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue the nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the 2 leaf gates, and the gates shall not be shut. Nearly 150 years before Cyrus sent his armies into Babylon, God had already said that Cyrus was going to come and he was going to do this work. And so history tells us that Cyrus goes, he diverts the Euphrates River, and of course all the armies were able to come in. Nobody was killed that night, well, besides the king, and so they were able to take they were able to take care of Babylon. But in conclusion, I would like us to focus on Daniel chapter 5 and verse 5. The very same hand, when we look at the way that God deals with nations, when you look at the way that God brought judgment to the Babylonians, sometimes it might be a little scary. You might feel that, okay, they defied God, and now all of a sudden God is sending judgments to them. But the very same hand that wrote on the wall that night is the very same hand that we see in Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 33. So we're going to go Jeremiah chapter 33 and verse 33. It says, "For this is a covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them," and then he adds, "and I will write it on their hearts." So the very same hand that was writing the judgment and was writing this in the walls of Babylon is the very same God that wants to write his law and put it in our hearts. And it is the very same hand that we also see in Exodus 31:18, where God himself writes the 10 Commandments in the stable of stones. So when we look at the character of God, one of the things that will become very apparent to us is that God is very patient. God gives us a lot of time, and his whole point and his whole desire is for us to come to him and to give our hearts to him. And so when we look at the life of King Belshazzar and you compare it with the life of King Nebuchadnezzar, we see two people that had the same opportunities, they had the same knowledge, and they both did two different things with this knowledge. Nebuchadnezzar decided to repent and surrender his life to God, and on the other hand, Belshazzar, same knowledge, same opportunities, same position, did something completely opposite and defied the King of God. But in the end, we realize that God was merciful, and each of them had the same opportunity. So may the Lord help us, and when we are confronted with a choice to make, I hope that we can all make the same choice that Nebuchadnezzar made at the end of his life. Amen.